In October 2017, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stood before a global audience of investors and announced what he called the most ambitious development project in human history. A city of 9 million people. No cars, no roads, flying taxis, robot servants, an artificial moon illuminating the night sky. All of it powered entirely by renewable energy. All of it built in the desert of northwestern Saudi Arabia. Budget, $500 billion. 8 years later, the project's centerpiece had its construction formally suspended. $50 billion had been spent. The internal audit that leaked to the Wall Street Journal put the actual cost of completion at $8.8 trillion, a number that exceeds 4 times Saudi Arabia's entire annual GDP. The full build-out date? 2080. NEOM's collapse is not a story about construction delays. It's a story about how petrostate credibility gets built, how it gets spent, and what happens when the financing model depends on a story the market stops believing. That's the framework this video is going to give you. NEOM was announced at the inaugural Future Investment Initiative Conference in Riyadh on October 24, 2017. The name combined the Greek word for new with the first letter of the Arabic word for future, and reportedly the first letter of Mohammed bin Salman's own name. That detail matters. NEOM was personal in a way most state development projects aren't. Its success or failure was going to attach directly to MBS's credibility as a reformer. Understanding what was promised, precisely, is the first step to understanding how badly the gap between promise and reality grew. Most coverage treats the original announcements as entertainment. They were actually a specific financing strategy. The maximalism wasn't accidental. It was designed to produce a specific effect on foreign investors. The original NEOM plan was described as a cross-sector economic zone the size of Belgium, 26,500 square kilometers in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia, bordering the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. It would encompass a floating industrial port, luxury island resorts, a mountain ski destination, and, at its heart, a revolutionary new type of city. In January 2021, MBS announced the line specifically, a 170-kilometer linear city, 2 parallel mirrored buildings, each 500 meters tall and 200 meters wide, running from the desert through the Hijaz Mountains to the Red Sea. 9 million residents, a high-speed rail running the full length in under 20 minutes. Every urban service, schools, hospitals, parks, workplaces, accessible within a 5-minute walk for every resident. 0 cars, 0 roads, 0 carbon emissions. The strategy behind these announcements was legible to anyone who had watched how sovereign wealth funds court foreign direct investment. The numbers were designed to be impossible to ignore. Media coverage was guaranteed. Investment forums would reference NEOM for years. Foreign companies would sign memoranda of understanding. The Saudi government's expectation, stated explicitly, was that private capital would eventually match and then exceed PIF's own investment, making the project self-financing over time. By 2025, the total foreign investment that had materialized for NEOM's construction was not close to what the model assumed. The only confirmed major foreign partnership for the line itself was a green hydrogen plant. The investment forums produced MOAs. The MOAs did not produce capital. NEOM's original promises were a financing strategy. The maximalism was intentional. The private capital it was designed to attract never came. When the line's full specifications were released in 2022, the architecture and engineering professions reacted with unusual public candor. Imperial College London visiting professor Mike Cook told New Civil Engineer, "I think it's such a crackpot idea, as surely everyone agrees who is involved in city planning." That reaction wasn't aesthetic, it was structural. Understanding the engineering problems built into the line's design is what separates a superficial reading of NEOM's collapse from a structural one. This isn't a story about ambition exceeding execution. It's a story about a design that violated multiple fundamental constraints simultaneously, and about the internal culture that prevented those problems from reaching the decision maker who needed to hear them. Start with the physics. A linear city 200 meters wide and 170 kilometers long creates a specific problem for every urban function it needs to perform. Transit can move people along the length, but cross-city movement between the two parallel towers requires either long detours or a crossing mechanism. Sunlight reaches only one face of each tower for most of the day. Natural ventilation across a sealed glass structure in a desert environment demands extraordinary energy inputs. The city's geometry maximizes wall-to-volume ratio in the exact inverse of what efficient building design requires. Then the numbers. Housing 9 million people across 34 square kilometers means an average density of approximately 265,000 people per square kilometer. For comparison, Manhattan, one of the densest urban environments on Earth, runs at roughly 28,000 people per square kilometer. The line would need to be nearly 10 times denser than Manhattan, vertically stacked inside a structure taller than any building ever constructed, in a desert with no existing infrastructure within hundreds of kilometers. The internal audit that leaked to the Wall Street Journal in early 2025 found that NEOM executives, aided by McKinsey and Company, had relied on unrealistically rosy assumptions to justify cost overruns. It found evidence of deliberate manipulation of finances by certain members of management. McKinsey's fees alone had reached $130 million in a single year. Former managers and executives said later that those who raised doubts about the project's feasibility were removed. The architecture of a system where no one tells the decision maker the truth produces exactly the outcome that architecture always produces. The line's design violated fundamental urban planning principles from its announcement. The internal culture suppressed the people who knew it. Before a single foundation pile was driven for the line, land assembly for the NEOM development zone required the removal of the communities living there. The area in question had been inhabited for generations by members of the Howeitat tribe. They were not an incidental presence. The land had been their home for centuries. This chapter is not presented as a moral verdict on NEOM. It's presented as a structural fact about what megaproject development at this scale actually requires, and what the suppression of that fact in the public presentation of NEOM tells you about how the project was managed. The gap between the announced vision and the operational reality showed up here first, before the cost overruns, before the construction suspensions, before the CEO was fired. Beginning in 2018, the Saudi Public Investment Fund quietly acquired title to the land across NEOM's development zone. Communities were told to leave. The Howeitat tribe's members were given compensation offers they considered inadequate for losing land their families had farmed for generations. Many refused. Saudi security forces were deployed. In April 2020, Abdul Rahim Al-Howeitat, a tribal member who had publicly refused eviction and posted videos online documenting the pressure his community was under, was killed by Saudi security forces. He had posted a video predicting he might be killed. 3 of his relatives, Shadli, Atala, and Ibrahim Al-Howeitat, were sentenced to death by Saudi Arabia's specialized criminal court for resisting eviction. Other tribe members received prison sentences of up to 50 years. UN human rights experts publicly called for the executions to be suspended. Approximately 20,000 people were displaced in total for a project that, by 2025, had formally suspended construction on its centerpiece. They were moved for a city that will not be built at anything approaching its promised scale. That fact does not appear in NEOM's press releases. It is part of the gap between the vision and the reality that the title of this video names. The human cost of NEOM's land assembly was fully documented before a single residential unit was built. The 20,000 displaced for a city that won't be built is the gap made visible earliest. If you find this kind of breakdown useful, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it means the next video finds you automatically. So, the vision was physically impossible, the human cost was immediate, and the private capital never came. Yet Saudi Arabia spent $50 billion and kept announcing new milestones for 3 more years. How? NEOM's cost estimates have risen in 4 documented steps, each revealed through leaks or external reporting rather than official disclosure. The original $500 billion, announced in 2017, was already the largest single development budget ever publicly stated for a single project. Each subsequent revision made that figure look conservative. Tracking these revisions and what drove each one is how you understand what actually happened to NEOM. The project didn't fail because one big thing went wrong. It failed because a financing model that assumed private capital would arrive never adjusted when it didn't, and because oil price dependence, the exact thing NEOM was supposed to help Saudi Arabia escape, determined whether there was enough money in the PIF to keep building at all. The $8.8 trillion figure came from an internal audit presented to NEOM's board and reported by the Wall Street Journal in March 2025. It also found that the project would not reach its so-called end state until 2080. The first phase, expected to cost $370 billion, would only be completed by 2035. The scale back of ambitions was accelerating in parallel, from 9 million residents by 2030 to 1.5 million to 300,000 to a current target of up to 100,000. The financing pressure came from a specific chain. Saudi Arabia's fiscal break-even oil price, the crude price needed to balance the government budget, sits at roughly $90 to $96 per barrel. Oil traded around $65 to $71 per barrel through much of 2024 and early 2025. That gap forced Aramco to cut its dividend payments by approximately $40 billion for 2025, directly reducing the PIF's cash flow. The PIF's Giga project portfolio was written down by $8 billion at the end of 2024, with Giga project investments declining 12.4% year-on-year to $56.2 billion. NEOM was not mentioned in Saudi Arabia's pre-budget statement for 2026. In November 2024, NEOM's CEO, Nadhmi Al-Nasr, was abruptly dismissed following a high-profile but poorly received grand opening for Sindalah, the luxury island component that had finally opened 3 years late and at 3 times its original budget. The opening featured Will Smith and Alicia Keys. The event drew criticism rather than investment interest. Al-Nasr was gone within weeks. NEOM spent $50 billion proving that a project dependent on oil revenues cannot fund a city designed to replace oil revenues. The irony is structural, not incidental. By early 2026, what remained of NEOM was the more immediately practical, productive pieces. The Oxagon Industrial Port, a working commercial facility on the Red Sea, was receiving continued investment. NEOM announced a $5 billion partnership with DataVolt to build an AI data center campus cooled by Red Sea seawater, operational by 2028. The 170-kilometer residential city was on hold until after 2030 at the earliest. The mountain ski resort Trojana had its Asian Winter Games hosting rights withdrawn. The luxury island Sindalah remained effectively closed to the general public. The pivot from linear city to AI data center hub tells you something specific about how Gulf state megaproject announcements work, and why the framework for reading them matters more than any individual project's status. The data center pivot is, in a purely functional sense, sensible. Saudi Arabia has surplus land, access to Red Sea cooling water, cheap energy from its own oil production, and $40 billion committed through its new state AI company, Humane. The global AI infrastructure boom requires enormous capital deployment in server farms. The Gulf's geography makes it a plausible regional data center hub. DataVolt's $5 billion partnership is a real commercial deal, not a memorandum of understanding. What the pivot also reveals is the gap between 2 types of megaproject logic. The original NEOM was a signaling project designed to announce Saudi Arabia's post-oil ambition to the world, attract foreign investment through the credibility of the vision, and generate enough momentum that the project would eventually become self-financing. The data center pivot is a deployment project, land and capital being matched to a globally underserved infrastructure need with near-term commercial returns. The lesson for anyone tracking Gulf state investment announcements is precise. When a state with significant capital announces a project whose scale is intended to generate investor excitement and whose financing model depends on that excitement producing private capital, the correct question to ask is not whether the vision is compelling. It's whether the private capital is already committed or whether it's assumed to follow. For NEOM, the private capital was always assumed. It arrived in a fraction of the volumes the model required. Saudi Arabia is not abandoning its post-oil diversification agenda. The 2034 FIFA World Cup will be hosted in the kingdom. Expo 2030 in Riyadh is proceeding. The PIF's international investment portfolio in technology, sport, and financial markets continues to grow. What ended was one specific bet, that a 170-kilometer mirrored building in a desert could be financed through the combined force of state capital and international investor enthusiasm. That bet failed. The agenda behind it is still live. NEOM's pivot from linear city to AI infrastructure is a retreat from signaling to function. The post-oil agenda continues. This specific vehicle for it does not. NEOM didn't run out of ambition. It ran out of money. Specifically, it ran out of PIF money, the capital that flows from Saudi Aramco's dividends into the sovereign wealth fund that MBS chairs and that funded NEOM's construction. When Aramco cut its dividend by $40 billion for 2025, the PIF's ability to sustain spending on capital-intensive projects with no near-term revenue collapsed. NEOM's construction suspension followed directly. Aramco's profits aren't complicated to understand at the surface level. It's the world's largest oil company, and oil prices were high in 2022. What most people don't understand is why Aramco makes nearly 3 times what ExxonMobil makes in the same commodity market, and why a drop in oil prices from $90 to $65 doesn't just hurt Aramco's margins. It directly determines whether projects like NEOM get built or suspended. The mechanism connecting a barrel of oil coming out of the Ghawar field to a construction crane stopping in the Tabuk Desert is specific and traceable. The previous video on this channel maps exactly that mechanism, Aramco's $3.75 per barrel production cost, and why Western majors can't replicate it, the nationalization that routed all profits to the Saudi state, the PIF dividend flow, and the 2019 drone attack on Abqaiq that showed what happens to global oil supply when that infrastructure is threatened. By the end of it, you'll have a complete structural read on why Saudi Arabia's post-oil ambitions are real, why their funding is fragile, and why NEOM was always one oil price cycle away from what happened to it.